Well, thank you very much. And thank you all. Everyone are busy people, and to come out late in the afternoon I'm very honored to have so many of you here. I'm honored also the Consul General of Israel and his son visiting are here with us right now, and I'm honored that you're here, Your Excellency. Thank you for coming. I will talk about water, and I'll do it in a moment, but if I may, we are also, you reminded me by sort of a somewhat comical comment you made. I don't think you intended it to turn so serious. But we are living through a period, somewhat of a crisis of governance around the world. If you look at the many, what we think of as liberal democracies around the world, over the past handful of years, we've had, whether it's because of economic upheaval or I have a theory that part of this is a fear of an immigration crisis, which I'll be talking about in connection to water in a few minutes. We've had something of an upheaval. This, of course, has happened, we know, sitting here in Brazil, so we know that we've had, for a whole bunch of reasons, a problem of governance here in the United States, where I'm from. Obviously, there's been a severe problem, and all throughout Europe, whether it's the Brexit vote for the UK, which is really a statement of a dissatisfaction with the status quo, or the elections in France, which with just a small change in events could have gone the other way. We see in Central and Eastern Europe rise of populist parties. Just this past weekend, the rise of a right-wing party in I think Austria it is. The world goes in cycles, and it is a frightening moment that we are in, I believe, for me, for people who treasure the system we have, and that I am at this foundation, and who is named for one of the people who has been one of the truly the great people of governance, taking a country out of a period of difficulty into a period of good governance, is something that is meaningful to me. That, I mean, I speak very widely. I'm speaking all over the world now for over 2 years since the book took off. But there are a handful of venues that I speak at that are emotionally important to me. And therefore, Sergio, I really wanted to thank you for having extended the invitation to my beloved publisher, Jose Goldfarb. So thank you very much for that.
Our common friend.
Okay. So I'll tell you how I came to write this book quickly, and I'll tell you what I think it all means, and I'll tell you a little bit what I think it means for Brazil, and I hope we can have a robust conversation about it. It's kind of an accident how I came to write the book. As Sergio said, I didn't set out intending to write a book, although it's a nice accident to have in life. If you're having a midlife crisis, I think it's better to write a book than to necessarily divorce your wife and get a red sports car. It's cheaper, and in my case, I'm much happier as a result that I chose to stay with.
I mean, you can do both, right?
I actually love my wife, and I don't like driving. So I think writing the book was the default position. It worked out pretty well for me. So here's what happened. I was at a foreign policy think tank that I'm a member of called the Council on Foreign Relations. And I heard a brief presentation by a senior U.S. government intelligence official who shared a just declassified top secret report that said that the world was going into a period of water scarcity. It said, and this is online, and if anybody wants, if you want afterwards, we can trade business cards, or I can share with you. I think it's one of the first footnotes in the book. I have it in the footnotes, so you can find the report for yourself. And the report said, I'll summarize it, assuming you're not going to look for it. The report said that by the year 2025, about 60% of the world's land mass would be affected by water scarcity. This would directly affect at least 1 billion people, probably more, and indirectly affect many billions of people beyond that. It would lead to higher food prices. It would lead to social instability and unrest in many countries. It would lead to the failure of a number of countries that are currently teetering anyway, and that because this was a U.S.-centered intelligence report, it said that it could even require a rethinking of America's very large, $700 billion defense budget to account for the moment that we were going into. And I was curious to understand more about the causes and the effects. Now, probably this is a serious audience of serious people. You don't come to this type of stuff if you're looking to go to a comedy club. We hope we have a few laughs, but just because the world is coming to an end doesn't mean we can't smile. But we can hope that that you're serious people, and probably like me, you hear things, you become very excited or engaged about something, and then for somewhere between 10 minutes or a week, you read a lot about it, and then somehow or other it just sort of evaporates into the ether. But in this case, for reasons that I still don't quite understand why, it just grabbed my attention, and I couldn't stop reading about it and focusing on it. And as time went by, there was something about it that took my interest. Now, I want to also frame for you that there are specific causes for this global water scarcity, and it's not the only one that you would think. Most everybody would correctly assume that climate change was an important element of this, and it is. But it isn't by any means the only culprit. We are about 7 billion people in the world today, and we are expected by UN estimates to rise to at least 10 billion people. And that's a pretty big percentage increase, and if we are already pinched for water where we are, to grow enough food, and this is an economic opportunity for Brazil, I might add, if we are pinched for the food where we are, to grow food for another 3 billion or 4 billion people is going to really be a very challenging task. That's one. Second of all is we're not only growing more numerically, we are also actually becoming more affluent. And again, a UN figure, it's estimated that by the year 2028, 1.3 billion people who are currently living in poverty will rise to what you might call the economic middle class, not necessarily swimming pools or Beverly Hills, but having a diet more like the diet we all eat. And by that I mean there may be in this room vegetarians or vegans, or if not, you certainly know somebody who is, I'm sure, but nobody who is or who we know is a vegetarian or vegan because of economic reasons. You choose not to eat meat or any animal product because of ethical reasons or health reasons or some other reason like that, but not because you can't afford to buy a piece of cheese or to buy a piece of chicken. But it turns out that one of the hallmarks of people like us is that we do have that diet, and it takes an enormously larger amount of water to grow food for our diet than for that of a poor person. Poor people live on rice or corn or wheat, and to give just one statistic, it takes 17 times more water to raise a pound of beef than to grow a pound of corn. And if you'll just extrapolate that number by the 1.3 billion that's estimated by the UN, you're starting to understand an enormous extra level of care. And there are other reasons too, and I hope I can get into them later because several of them are very relevant to Brazil. But those were the leading reasons that he raised and that I saw in my early reading. But as I started to look around for solutions, because I didn't want to just dwell on how horrible things were, I wanted to. I'm a business person, at least I was at that time, and I've long been an activist, and I wanted to see what we could do to get out of this rut that it looked like we were, this abyss that it looked like we were heading towards. So everywhere I looked for solutions, I was somewhat amazed to discover that it was in Israel that solutions to water scarcity had either been invented or were in which Israel had played a leading part in its development. And that to me was shocking because I had been to Israel a number of times, and the country that I knew was the country that sort of you would imagine. It's in the driest region in the world. 2/3 of the country is desert. It only rains for a few months of the year, and even then usually not very hard. And therefore, you would think that the country would be quite water scarce. In addition, Israel, it turns out, is a country where everybody has water on demand, and in much of the world, water is turned on and off either to help reduce the amount of leakage or because there just isn't enough supply, so they give neighborhoods a day or two a week, and you have to save up your water, and if you run out, you have to buy water from a water truck. But Israel, it's 24/7 on-demand water for everybody who wants it. And in addition, even though agriculture is the largest consumer of water everywhere, about 70% on average around the world, a little higher in Brazil, but even though that's the case, remarkably, Israel is self-sufficient in fruits and vegetables, has a multi-billion-dollar agricultural export industry, and that also didn't quite fit my sense of how this is possible in a country that's so dry and so much desert. And on top of that, as I learned, actually to my surprise, that Israel provides the Palestinians in the West Bank with more than half of the water, about 55% of the water they consume in the West Bank, a very significant amount of water they consume in Gaza, even during periods of conflict. Even when periods when rockets are flying out of Gaza, Israel continues to pump water into Gaza. And in the last about 20 years now, Israel also provides the Kingdom of Jordan with a very significant amount of water, and in recent years has upped that very significantly because of Jordan's much greater need for water because of the many Syrian Civil War refugees there. So I looked at this and I said to myself, how in the world did this happen? And I went to Israel. This is what I was describing to you, Sergio. I went to Israel. I ended up going back and forth, spent many weeks there. I ended up interviewing in all 220 people, which is a lot of interviews. I interviewed many of them multiple times, a total of 580 interviews. I interviewed 180 Israelis, 20 Palestinians, and 20 either U.S. government officials or heads of NGOs involved with water, to try to get a 360-degree view of what it was that Israel had done. So I'll tell very briefly what it is, some of the things that Israel had done, and then maybe I can relate it to the Brazil story, and then we'll open up to conversation. So what is it that Israel did? First of all, culture is a really very important thing. Culture and education are very important, and culture is enduring, and the education you receive when you're 3 years old and 5 years old and 10 years old tends to be something that will stay with you the rest of your life. And so in Israel, part of the educational system, it teaches both conservation and I don't mean this in a religious sense, but a reverence for water. And because of that, the country, people use water freely. I'm not trying to pretend they're a bunch of water-saving zealots or robots or anything like that. They're not. I mean, they're normal people in Israel in terms of use of water. But before they turn on the tap, they think twice. And rather than let it run, when they go off to get the towel or something like that, they shut it off. And that type of mentality is not just relevant for domestic use, but it also becomes how they think about it in the use for industry, how they think about it for use in agriculture, and so forth. Second of all, in most of the world, water is administered by the political class. And Israel made a decision that that's dangerous because politicians do what politicians do, which is not saying that they're corrupt, although sometimes they are, but they reward the people who got them to office, or they think that's just part of being good governance, maybe. I'm not questioning their motives. But Israel made the decision that having politicians involved in the administration of water was a dangerous thing to do. And so for a number of years now, water has been administered by a technocratic, apolitical body where politicians basically have no role whatsoever, other than appointing the head every 5th year, and then the organization is self-run. And it's an organization, as I say, of people who are professionals. And their job, their mandate, is to provide the greatest amount of water for the largest number of people, and this is crucial, and to plan very far in the future. So they have to think about, and this is going to lead me to one of my next points, they have to be thinking about technologies that in many cases do not yet exist. They make a plan saying we need to get to this, and we will need to incentivize inventors to be thinking about technologies that have not yet been invented, otherwise we can't get to that finish line. And then in addition, something else that Israel does that's extremely important is, this is also I found very surprising, because around the world, water is ordinarily subsidized by the government. In Israel, there are no subsidies whatsoever. In fact, the government pays nothing in towards the administration, the cleaning, the finding, the pumping of water. And in fact, they make money on it because a sales tax, a VAT tax, is charged on the water bills that everybody gets. But the government itself provides no funding. 100% of the funding is provided by the public in a formula, which I don't want to get into now, but I can if someone has a question about it. 100% of the funding is provided by the public. And what that has is multiple very positive effects. First of all, the water utilities have all the money they need to run their utility. Second of all, market forces work. We believe in market forces in just about everything we do. A decision is made as to how we live our lives, the clothing we buy, the trips we take, the education we give ourselves and our families, the food we buy, everything. Market forces are relevant. But in water, market forces are almost never relevant. But in Israel, market forces are relevant. And so therefore, people respond as rational people in the same way that you respond as a rational person about every other economic decision you need to make and do make when you're paying the full price without a subsidy. But when you have a rich uncle who is paying for your vacation, you might just possibly, I mean, I can't think of anything worse than taking food out of the minibar. But you know, you might just possibly take flights that are the most expensive flights rather than the most logical flights. You might stay in a hotel that's much grander than what you need. But that's the effect of subsidies. Subsidies distort marketplaces. And then finally, I'd like to talk about the fact that Israel is known widely as a country that uses lots of technology and as the center of both problem solving and technology. And if that's true in cybersecurity, if that's true in computers, that's true in cell phones and laptops and autonomous vehicles and just about every other endeavor of technology, this is also true in water technology. And I'll just very quickly just give 3 examples. But there are truly dozens, if not hundreds, and I have many in my book. First of all, since we said before that agriculture is the largest consumer of water, Israel has from the beginning of the state, and even before it was a state, focused on how they could save water in agriculture. And it's not surprising, therefore, that Israel is the place where something called drip irrigation is invented. And what is drip irrigation? In most of the world, and overwhelmingly the case here in Brazil, overwhelmingly, fields are irrigated by either flooding them, turning on a big pipe and flooding the field, or else using sprinklers. In both of those techniques, massive amounts of the water are lost to evaporation, as much as 80%, usually no less than 45%, but at least as much as 80% of the water. And so it's sort of like spray and pray. You get the water on the field, maybe some of it hits the roots, and good luck. And the truth of the matter is, we know now from plant physiology, it's a little bit, to not bring up a bad period in American history, but it's a little bit like waterboarding. The plant actually goes through a boom and a bust cycle where it's drowning from too much water to when it's starving from having too little water, and then they flood the field again. And it actually reduces the plant's yield. It stresses the plant. Drip irrigation does something completely different. You plant under the soil, where the roots are, tiny drippers, which in a remarkable hydraulic act of hydraulics and engineering, drips tiny droplets of water at regular intervals exactly where the roots are, and it allows the plant to uptake that amount of water that it needs in a sort of a calm way. As a result of that, there is zero evaporation because there is no water that comes in contact with the air. And sometimes, like for nut trees and such, they put it on the surface, there's 4% evaporation loss, but that's negligible. So that's one very significant thing. And in Israel today, there is no flood irrigation permitted. It's illegal, actually. And 75% of the fields are irrigated with drip irrigation. And that's something that, as Brazil grows its irrigated area, because most of the rain-fed agriculture of Brazil is already spoken for. It's a vast industry. But the growth area is going to be growing from about the 5 million hectares, which are now irrigated, to the 30 million, which has the potential. And when that happens, you're going to have to figure out how you're going to irrigate those fields. And I would argue flood irrigating, that's probably the worst possible way to do it. And I'll just pause here to jump into an environmental issue. Anybody here from a farm? Because I'm guessing these are all city folks, right? We're all city folks? Okay.
Yeah.
So when you're a farmer, you need to provide, obviously, sunshine, which you don't provide. You need to provide water. You have to put the seed in the ground. But then there's the other essential ingredient, which is fertilizer. And since farmers know that if you put too little fertilizer on, the plant will not produce a yield, they over-fertilize almost everywhere. The plant can only take in a certain amount, and everything that is a surplus of that, it's nitrogen. Everything that's a surplus of that is either then absorbed into the soil and gets pollutes the groundwater, or when the winter rains come, it washes away, and that nitrogen, that fertilizer, that phosphorus, gets taken into rivers and lakes. And anytime you have an algal bloom, anytime you have those algae blooms, what that really means is that somebody was over-fertilizing and the water got transferred that way. That's why algal blooms happen. So if you want to make the environment cleaner, I would also say to you that using drip irrigation, regardless of the source of it, using drip irrigation is smarter because you can also put your nutrients into your drippers and then give only exactly what the plant needs, and all of that gets taken up, and none of that nitrogen and phosphorus gets transferred into the water. I'll just do very quickly, because I want to stop, but to open it up. But there are just 2 other technologies to mention. First is, we know that a significant environmental problem and infrastructure problem for Brazil is that the country still does not adequately treat all of its sewage. Sewage is the stuff that goes down your shower, your washing machine, your dishwasher, your bathtub, your kitchen sink, and also your toilet. That material can be treated to a very high level where it can then be, with some safety, put into waterways, but you have to treat it. And something close to 40% of Sao Paulo's sewage goes untreated. It's conveyed, it's taken, it's conveyed, and it's dumped directly into a river without any intermediary treatment. A full 10% of Sao Paulo's sewage is never treated at all in any way. It doesn't even go through a pipe. It goes directly from, it's not collected, it goes from a home into a dump, and it pollutes the region that you're in, the area that you're in. So this is an important thing for Brazil, and particularly Sao Paulo, to be thinking about and fixing for itself. But in Israel, they made a decision back in 1952 that they wanted to have an alternative source of water, and they began planning for and building out a parallel national water infrastructure system where they capture nearly 100% of all their sewage. They treat it to a very high level, and about 86% of that water, that now treated water, that actually is clean enough that you could drink it if you had to drink it, but they know that nobody wants to drink that water. So they built out a parallel national water infrastructure system to convey that water to farms all over the country, and then that treated water is used for appropriate crops. Therefore, water that would otherwise need to be used to grow those crops can be saved for the environment or for some other day, years from now when the water is needed, like Sao Paulo might have had, or just is used for urban purposes. And the final thing I'll only say a sentence or two about is desalination. Desalination wasn't exclusively invented in Israel, but it was largely invented in Israel. And one of the great joys of the somewhat lonely task of researching a book is having the opportunity to go laboriously through the diaries of Israel's first and visionary prime minister, David Ben-Gurion, where he talked regularly about his dream of desalting the sea. And if he could desalt the sea, if the country could desalt the sea, they could have a robust agricultural future. Well, that's not completely true because he ended up using that water for domestic purposes, but today Israel, the equivalent of 80% of Israel's household water is water that was in the Mediterranean an hour or two earlier. And if you think, is that dirty water? Actually, desalinated water is the absolutely cleanest water you could ever possibly drink. It's as pure or purer than rainwater. It's extraordinarily clean. And then I'd like to just close by saying one last word. Most people, or many people I should say, when thinking about Israel, they also think about the neighborhood that Israel's in and the conflict. And therefore, I want to say that one of the joys of this research project was to come to understand the ways in which water serves as a device, as a pathway to cooperation, to coexistence, and occasionally even to peace. It was because of China's fascination with Israel's advances in water technology that China decided to abandon its support of the Arab boycott of Israel, to reach out to Israel. At first, in secret, 2 separate teams of Israeli hydrologists came to China, gave them diagnoses, and the Chinese decided that they wanted to have the best of Israeli water ideas for their needs, which were and still are large. And they reached out to Israel, and they said that if they would be willing to send their leading water scientists to China to educate their scientists, China would do this in a public way. And within a year, diplomatic relations were established, which is a real triumph. Other stories like that. Iran, before the fall of the Shah, was very careful about having an engagement with Israel, yet they had a terrible earthquake that destroyed their irrigation systems, and they reached out to Israel in 1962. They asked them if they would please send 3 or 2 or 1 hydrologists, water scientists to Iran to help think this through. Within a matter of 3 years, there were hundreds and hundreds of them in Iran. There were so many Israelis in Iran that there were Hebrew language schools for the children of these hydrologists in Iran. It's quite remarkable. And I interviewed a number of the people who had been there. And then vis-a-vis the Palestinians, I said at the outset that these Palestinians get more than half of their water in the West Bank from Israel. And while the hostile elements, and I don't mean to pretend for a moment that Palestinians are necessarily happy about the totality of the relationship, but water is used as a device for engagement and conversation between the parties. And therefore, I think that there's lots of ways that we could see the future differently than the idea that, I don't speak Portuguese, but I sort of have the idea that Crise da Água probably means water crisis or something like that. And the truth of the matter is that we could have a very dire future, or we can be optimistic about it. We could think of water as becoming a source of conflict, or we could think of it as being a source of engagement and economic growth. And I hope, obviously, it's the second. And I think now at this point, I'd love to, if that's enough, if it's enough for me, I'd love to have a conversation, either answer questions or hear comments or thoughts that any of you have.
Okay, thank you so much.